Welcome to our next installment of the Inner West Youth Network videos. We're really excited that you've joined us. No matter where you are along the faith spectrum, if you're exploring Christianity or if you've been a Christian for ages, we really hope that this video is helpful for you. We represent a bunch of youth ministers from across the Inner West. I'm Luke, this is Elyse and Toby. We're going to be thinking today about the topic of suffering. For some of you, this might be a bit more of an academic or global question. You might be looking at the world around you and see things like the coronavirus and like wars happening and natural disasters, and you might be thinking, how could God possibly allow this to happen? This also might be a much more personal question for you. You might be experiencing something and be thinking, how could God possibly let this thing happen to me? If God's loving, then how could this be my experience of the world? If that is you and this video gets overwhelming for you, or you're really feeling it, feel free to press pause and take a break. Feel free to take a break forever and not come back, that's also okay. If you're feeling really distressed by this, do call the kids helpline. We've left the number in the description down below. That'd be a really good thing to do. It'd also be good to talk to your leaders if you're feeling overwhelmed. They're not counselors, but they can be really helpful for you. I thought a good place to start this would be to be thinking about, where does suffering come from? Maybe you're thinking that suffering is just the product of an uncaring universe thrown into chaos. Maybe you're thinking this suffering is God punishing me or God punishing us. So I think it's really helpful that we start with, where does it come from? So over to you guys.
Yeah, and it's such a great thing to be asking when looking at this topic, which affects so many people. The Bible pretty clearly talks about suffering. I mean, we look at the beginning of the Bible, Genesis, the first book, which talks about how God created the world. And when he created it, everything was good. And God loves his people. And he made this beautiful world for people. And in Genesis 3, we read how everything went horribly wrong. People didn't want to be in relationship with God. And in that moment, sin and suffering came into the world. People's relationship with God was broken, and things were just not as they should be. And maybe you actually know about that the world is weird. There are natural disasters, things go wrong, plagues, poor mental health, all these kinds of suffering that happen. Well, the writers in the New Testament in Romans say that the world is groaning. Things aren't as they should be. But God has always had a plan to restore the world and for things to be made right.
Yeah, we love to look at big arcs through God's creation of ideas. So if we're looking at suffering today, most of these arcs, spoiler, all of these arcs, they all go straight through Jesus. So if we look at what about suffering and Jesus, we see a man who did suffer a lot. And that's really good for us because Jesus is actually God. So Jesus is the one that can do something about suffering. So it's good for us, even though it was hard for him that he experienced suffering. Jesus came into the world, he experienced some deep suffering, but also when he died, which was kind of his ultimate moment of suffering, he actually opened the way for eventually our suffering to be defeated, essentially. And he also opened the way for that broken relationship we had with God to be fixed. So we're now living in this moment where our suffering has been beaten, but is not finished yet. But our relationship with God can really start to be a relationship again. Yeah. Looking forward to that future though, right?
Yeah, and in that future, suffering will end for Christians. For those who trust in what Jesus has done, when he comes back to take us to heaven, we read in Revelation 21 that actually there'll be no more suffering, there'll be no more tears or crying or pain. God will wipe those away. It'll be better than we can possibly imagine right now. But more than ending suffering, God is going to be there with his people, the relationship fully restored, people with God as they're meant to be. It's this beautiful picture of what the perfect life looks like, is a future with God in heaven.
Yeah, and so we have this big picture of the Bible that suffering isn't how the world was meant to be, that God created this world that was really good and a great place to live, but suffering made it a really hard place to live, and that Jesus experienced that and beat suffering, but also that there's a plan one day for that to be dealt with finally. If you're a Christian, then your suffering has an expiry date. It's not going to last forever. That is such good news, particularly if you're thinking that maybe this is God punishing me somehow, that I've done something wrong and so that's why I'm suffering. It's so good to know that actually it's because the world is broken, it's groaning like you were saying, but also so good if you're thinking that this is the product of just a world thrown into chaos. You're almost a bit more right, like the world is broken and it's chaotic because of what happened with sin and people rebelling, but also at the heart that what's good about the world at the start of the world is that people know God and are known by God in a way that's good. So that's all about kind of big suffering, but what does the Bible have to say about my suffering now? How does it speak into that experience? Sometimes it feels like no one understands, maybe. What does the Bible have to say about suffering now and my experience of that?
Yeah, I mean, the first place that I would ever go when someone is suffering and we're having a chat about that, it's always the Psalms.
Yeah.
They're this beautiful book with heaps of emotion in them. And my favourite psalm is Psalm 73, so I thought in preparation for this video I'd dig through and see how many of those psalms you could potentially use for this type of situation. And I read through them really quickly and found Psalm 70, 71, 73, 75, 77 and 79. I think I might have
Okay.
But it was like 6 of the psalms of the 10
Yeah.
are useful for this type of thing. And that's a good portion of psalms are discussing really dark and sad things. If you go just a little bit further, Psalm 88 is one of the darkest passages in any type of media. It finishes with the line, "Darkness is my closest friend." And these are all prayers that God has written through people for us to pray to him. This is like a prayer book that God's given us to pray to him. And so he's expecting us to feel these things. He knows that we feel them. And he also has given us language and an expectation almost to speak to him about it. So I think that's comforting that he knows we're going to feel it and that he's given us words to say that to him when we do feel it. Yeah.
Yeah. And we know that Jesus himself felt this immense suffering when he died for us on the cross. So in terms of our experience, we know that actually our Saviour knows exactly what it's like. That's not to make a light of your situation, but to say he knows what you're going through. So you can call out to God and talk to him about this. And you might be experiencing some things going on at the moment. It's important to talk about them, be it to God, be it to other people. He's given you a community of people to be in. And so it's really important to talk to leaders, talk to trusted friends. Let them help you and listen, because people aren't living a cookie cutter life. People are going through things at different times in different ways. We have a habit of trying to bury it, but actually it's really important to speak about it because suffering is real and what people experience.
Yeah, totally. And it's so good to know that we're not alone in that as we experience suffering, and as we cry out to God in that we aren't doing that alone, that we, as our voices cry out, we join with the voices of thousands and probably millions of Christians who have done that across the years. And so it's so good to get to do that God listens and cares as well. That's so good. But also that God really blesses us in giving us each other as a really huge tool to help us in our suffering, that we're not alone. That's beautiful. And so I guess the question that's left is, what do we do with that? We've kind of spoken about, we share that with each other. What do we do knowing all of this stuff from the Bible? How do we actually land that in our lives?
I think there's a big challenge here for us. I think looking at that big arc that we looked at, we were talking about how suffering entered in Genesis and Jesus dealt with that, but it's only really going to be finally fixed in Revelation when he comes back again. But the other thing we're speaking about the whole time, we did this on purpose, is the broken relationship thing. And that's actually the deeper thing. So we feel this suffering and it's right that we feel it and that we're hurt. But the bigger thing, the more core problem has been fixed by God as well. So some of it is us just changing our perspective a bit on what the thing we're really chasing after is. Is it no pain? Is it pleasure? Or is it actually the relationship with God? So I think there's this complicated, like when we're thinking about suffering, we need to feel it, experience it, share it with each other, take it to God, but also not think that it's the biggest thing in the world. Yeah. keeps in perspective.
Yeah, and often you'll hear Christians talking about a joy and a hope and being how good and happy things are, and yeah, there are joyful and hopeful things, but that doesn't mean you're always going to feel them, or that you're always going to feel happy and good and like everything's perfect. That's not what the Christian life promises. It promises things are going to be hard, but you can speak to God. You have Jesus who's been through it, and you have people around you to talk to and to work things out with and to get support from.
Yeah, and so I guess there's this reimagining that we need to do of what the good life is. I think the world tells us all the time that the good life is about avoiding pain and pursuing pleasure. But actually, the Bible tells us the good life is to know and be known by God. That's the best thing. So in your suffering, you can still do that. Like it doesn't stop you from knowing and being known by God. So bring that to God, and remember that you're not alone in this. So bring it to each other and keep chatting about what is happening. Because we really want you to know that suffering really sucks. But God gives us tools to handle that. He gives us each other, He gives us His word that speaks into it. But we also want you to know that, that's not what the good life is. The good life is about knowing and being known by God. So we really hope that that's been an encouragement for you. Keep chatting about this with your leaders, particularly if you're feeling distressed by this or overwhelmed. We really encourage you to chat to someone about that. We're going to leave it there. It's been so good to have you join us.
Oh, hi. I didn't see you there. Thanks for watching this video though. If you want to see more of our content, you can follow us on Instagram on your device or phone, or you can click a link here, or click the subscribe icon. Remember, stay safe, stay healthy, love Jesus.